Alright, so my last recording got cut off a little bit there, so I'm going to continue with going through people that testified, and I was at Mr. Camus, I think, and just commenting on some of the things that they said. We were at the rejection of the dead people, I think, here, so I'm going to go talk about, he mentions for 6 seconds part of this hearing somewhere that, there's some filters that have been put into place, and, these filters are going to capture some appropriate, there's always going to be, some measure to stop the bad returns are going to inevitably, is going to have some negative effect on the positive ones. It's over here at 45. 25. If I'll be allowed to scroll to 45:25.
And more. Now they're funds approaches to the fraud. The criminals change because it's such a lucrative environment. Our audit staff continues to look at the filters that the IRS has in place and comment and recommend additional or approved filters. And we have seen improvement in some of them, but it continues to be a major challenge to keep up with the criminal enterprise.
So what he's basically talking about there is, he'll as the IRS notices patterns that are associated with these returns with the fake income and the fake withholding, prepared with cheap tax software and electronically filed with a stolen name and and ID number, what ends up happening is that the IRS starts to make note of these patterns. And so when they find out their returns get rejected, then they see what if we change this number over here a little bit and this number here a little bit and that number here a little bit, we'll see if it goes through. Oh, it did. Okay, let's keep doing that. And then the IRS will adjust their pattern and they'll just try something else. And, just a circle of nothing, And again, keep going back to the same thing. If they just did the authentication test up front, they're spending a bunch of money making these filters when all they have to do is just compare the W-2 to the purported W-2s that are on the tax returns. It blows my mind, why they're wasting any money adjusting their filters and things like that. And all it really ends up going to do is there's going to be more and more people that are actually legitimate files that are going to fall within the range of these filters. And then they're going to have just a pointless notice to respond to and more hassles and delayed refunds and things like that.
Well, thank you. Senator White, we'll turn to you.
Thank you very much, and this has been a superb panel, Mr. Chairman, and Ms. Clem, thank you for...
Okay, so now I want to look at 4730 to 4855, which I thought was interesting. And then there's going to be a question by Senator Wyden that strikes me humorous because there's no real competent possible answer you can give to the question, except for saying that we're not going to use Social Security numbers anymore for authentication, and no one's willing to say that. So it comes down to just flowery kind of corporate speak and things like that, or political verbiage that sounds like we're here for the tax, but it's empty. We'll see that come up. Let's see, where are we at? 4730? Just about.
The agreements or working relationships we would have various foreign governments can create issues.
Let's talk. I found this interesting. There were of course, electronically filed returns could be probably electronically filed from anywhere in the world. And, if the person committing the crime is outside the jurisdiction of the United States, as well as being untraceable, it makes things very difficult. But if they really follow a trail and they finally find out that the individual that's doing these fraudulent returns is from another country, this is the issue he's addressing. Then we're going to get to the strange question. But basically, this guy, Timothy Camus, is going to, at the end, when he's asked, about ultimately what to do when these other countries won't cooperate, to bring, one of their nationals to justice in the United States for United States tax fraud. All he can say is just give kind of like political speak, and it's empty. It just says, that's why we take this crime very seriously. Stuff like that. He has no answer. There is no solution. That's the 5.8 billion probably that
It's there, and we would ask for help for that. But the problem we're seeing now is that because there's been money paid, we're seeing other spin-offs of this crime. So although we're focused and we think we know where it originated to start, we're now starting to see indications that other criminals have ripped off the original idea, and now they're launching these types of attacks. So it continues to be a challenge, but I think we're onto something, but it would certainly be something we could use some help on down the road as far as getting our hands on a foreign national and bring them to justice in the United States for a white-collar crime.
Without compromising the investigation, can you tell us a little bit? You said there were some problems in working with the foreign governments. Can you just give us a little bit of a sense of what those are?
Well, as you can imagine, in the world today, not all foreign governments would feel sorry for the United States. With our citizens and the integrity of our financial systems suffering these types of scams. It's one of the reasons my agency takes this crime so seriously.
So, I'm sorry I have to laugh at that, because that's all he can say. We take, to make him puff himself up as the person that, no one, not even Superman, some fictitious being would be able to solve this issue. So, but he still has to give some kind of answer to kind of make it seem like. Now, earlier in there, he was, again, there was just a lot of empty words. There wasn't really anything specific. Like, okay, well, we have agreements with these nations, and the Attorney General. I'm not saying this guy's trying to brush anything under the carpet, but he's in an impossible situation, in part, under certain circumstances, and that's part of the problem. And he's doing the right thing by describing it. It's just that sometimes people are asked questions that there really is no good answer for, and I'll show that. I'm not coming down on Senator Wyden, of course, because as far as he knows, things can be done about but see, the crime of internet hacking and things like that is completely interrelated. You may or may not catch the criminals, and a lot of the time they get caught because they make just one mistake, as what happened, say, back 3-4 years ago with Lulsec. The leader was caught. He's caught with his originating IP revealed. And then that's what brought everything else down. But if it wasn't for that, he may, as long as he doesn't make a mistake, he won't be caught. And that's the same thing with these other people that break in and, steal IDs from Anthem. And that hasn't been solved. And so when, I can only laugh at the question that Senator Wyden asked, because there's no real answer for it. And the real answer to his question is that we at the IRS have come to the realization this is what the answer should be, but they're not saying this, and they never will, and it hasn't even occurred to them. What I'm saying is I'm providing the answer for them now is what it should be, but they're not doing it, and that answer is that we're not going to use Social Security numbers anymore for authentication. Instead, we're going to use PINs. Of course, that answer is not provided. It's not even discussed at this hearing, and that's what's so troubling about it.
Because it impugns the integrity of the Internal Revenue Service. So there are those out there that
We go here to
don't feel bad
49.50.
for the United States.
Okay, so Wyden's going to ask this question now.
The IRS and the states. So I would be interested in the panel's recommendations on what else we need to do to give you the tools to fight ID theft from cyber attacks. So any of you that would like to get into it, I saw all the state officials already nodding their heads. Why don't we hear from Indiana first, just to keep things in the center. I always like to get to the center before the far right and the far left go at it.
Thank you, Senator.
Yeah, he's all red-faced because there really isn't an answer for all this. And then all he's gonna really end up talking about are all the inconveniences that he's gonna end up imposing on taxpayers from his state that can only peripherally try to address the issues, but don't really directly address the issues, and really just end up being more of a problem, I think, for taxpayers, and probably in some cases have actually flagged innocent people, and that's not reflected in his answer there. And it seems like he's the smiley face man who is smiling about the fraudsters that he stopped, but he's also doesn't realize he's smiling about the people that's no doubtedly of a smaller group, but some of them probably do exist that have been greatly inconvenienced by his policies. And that's all he can do because he isn't addressing the problem directly, or there's no answer for that, except to say our state's going to start using PINs. We're not using Social Security numbers anymore. That's the answer. If you don't use that answer, the problem's going to persist.
Well, we certainly are seeing, in fact, anecdotally, we're seeing a significant increase in the number of valid stolen IDs in Indiana, with Anthem being based in Indiana. So we already are seeing the impact of that. I think, many of the steps that they are taking, that corporations all across the country are having to take, is to...
Okay, here's the classical nothing answer. What are you going to do? We're taking the steps that the other people are taking the steps that are corporate across America, and in the body. We're really, this is what you're going to hear.
Do more multifaceted authentication in terms of access.
Now that, okay, maybe, as I suggested, some other way to identify a person. The problem is what happens when he's going to talk about how they hired LexisNexis and they, ended up flagging returns and sending, multiple choice questionnaires by mail to taxpayers. They'd have to answer correctly to get the refund. And what if LexisNexis didn't collect their information correctly? What if they got it wrong? Well, you get to play multiple guesses to see if you get the refund that you're actually due back, and and there may have been some case in Indiana where this happened. I'm not meaning to criticize the guy, but it really does. When you're trying to just solve the problem and you haven't really sorted it, in general, haven't sorted out what really the root of the issue is. Because it's very complex to actually understand, then you're going to end up, hunting for fish with a shotgun and in a metal tank in which people are standing in the outside. Some of the bullets are going to hit the innocent bystanders, is what I think.
Their systems.
But he won't talk about that.
Many companies have not invested adequately to prepare themselves for that and allow themselves to be vulnerable. So I think that's one key thing that corporate America and all of us, even at the governmental level, need to focus on. In terms of what we can do as a group, I think it goes back to that three-legged stool I spoke about earlier. And it's making sure that we are sharing those information elements more readily and more rapidly, as Commissioner Valentine indicated. Oftentimes
I do find this idea of sharing information a little troubling, inasmuch that there are some cases where, at a state level, certain states have disputes over who gets to tax who, and if they're getting information for the IRS, some people might end up being double taxed as a result. The real issue is, as I look at it, the Indiana Revenue Commissioner, my belief is that the problem is rooted in fictitious wages and fictitious withholding resulting in a refund getting through the system. Again, it's that dollar amount check, and there must be some agency in Indiana that handles payroll, and that's the people they should be contacting, not the IRS. So the information sharing to me seems almost like an excuse to do more spurious things that could be considered out of range for what's proper. Rather than, as I was referring to earlier, rather than just looking to the to their own agencies to find the answers that they have, because certainly, anyway.
We do get a great deal of information that we share with one another, but it is not on a timely basis. I would also really like to see the IRS take a greater leadership role in terms of driving many of the standards or expectations. We have 50 states, and many of them do
I could agree with that.
have taxing mechanisms and departments of revenue all doing disparate things. And if we could have the IRS help us to bring everybody together to establish a coordinated, collaborated set of standards.
To some degree I agree, some degree I don't. The standard, and what he's really talking about is, some of the states actually rely on what the federal does, and they just kind of piggyback on it to save money. That should not be that way with state income tax withheld. With other types of income, perhaps. But a lot of that is just self-reported anyway. Sometimes rents are important. Non-employee compensation, things that come on 1099s. But those are all things that don't have anything to do with, no one's going to put, fraud, overstate, these are issues that are only for legitimate taxpayers. Someone filing a fraud return isn't going to forget to include some kind of income. They wouldn't even know about it, So he's actually not addressing the issue. I don't think, unless if it's wages, and the wages are just, you're going to find that in your own state. We're only talking about wages, and we're only talking about, so we got very limited. A lot of the time, they don't withhold state income tax out of dividends or interest. So it's really literally, or Social Security, it's just pensions and wages. So they might have an issue with pensions. But honestly, that usually does not result in a refund. They could just do some simple math. If the withholding exceeds 15%, it doesn't really. That would be enough of a red flag. We could stop it right there. So I don't know what this guy's talking about, actually.
That of expectations from our software vendors, from financial institutions as well too. I think that could be
Now that I agree with. So, it's good I'm watching this.
A great deal in bringing everybody together on the same platform.
My time is up. That's something.
All right, so now I'm going to look at 2504 to 2511. This is the Indiana. Did I already do that?
U.S. companies, we believe the availability of valid stolen IDs has never been greater, and the fraudsters have clearly upped their game, and we must do.
Yeah, I've got that. Okay, so now let's look at 2572. You said anything else? It was 2752.
Finally, I just note that the prepaid debit cards are an issue that I think needs to be addressed. It is a preferred tool of fraudsters in receiving their refunds. We found that over 50% of those returns with prepaid debit cards are fraudulent.
Okay, to stop there, when we get to the guy from Utah, I believe, he's going to say he can't differentiate between a prepaid debit card and a check. So this guy from Indiana ought to talk to the guy from Utah so they can sort things out, because clearly one of them is incorrect. The implication of what he just said and what he's probably gonna say, if it wasn't clear already, is that they can identify. How can they say that 50% of the fraudulent refunds were for direct deposits against debit cards, unless, of course, they knew how to identify the debit cards?
In terms of some recommendations on things we can do, we consider that the solution really...
Yeah, okay. Got done with that. So let's go to John Valentine here, 3110. And he's aggressive. In my mind, he might be a little bit too aggressive. He is too aggressive. One time he gives this squint in the eye like he knows something. And I know there's got to be some people that were a few, small portion of the people that are flagged by this squinty eye, and he's going to say, we've caught these fraudulent returns. It doesn't mean some of them weren't actually fraudulent, and that's the negative impacts of going tough or advocating on things that you really can't exactly know.
And thank you also for giving us this time. Esteemed members of the committee, I'm here to discuss ways to reduce the tax frauds that we're seeing develop this country. There's 4 issues that you really ought to consider. Number 1, strengthen information sharing between the IRS and...
Actually, I need another minute here.
As we began to process returns, our system started sending out error notices that said that these were fraudulent returns.
I mean, it's just based on patterns of things that could actually be legitimate in the return, and they're sending out fraud notices. That's what I was talking about before. But he's not going to admit to that. But I could draw that conclusion. There's got to be some of the ones that he sent out his fraud notices to that were not fraudulent.
We then followed up with verification letters of the suspicious returns to the taxpayers. Within 10 days...
So they got the hassle, and he's only going to talk about the ones that said, these are fraudulent. He's not going to talk about the ones that said, hey, what's wrong with you guys? This return isn't fraudulent. What the hell's wrong with you?
After opening the filing season, we began receiving calls from taxpayers saying, we have not filed our returns yet.
Now, the result ended up being good, but still, there were some people that were inconvenienced by this. So I place more of the blame on the fraudsters, of course, but also in the way the solution was proposed. Again, the Utah is going to have a state agency that handles payroll. And, one would think they would have earnings records that are comparable to the returns, or they have to have a policy that they're going to issue a refund until they can do so.
We initially thought that these were isolated incidents, but as the week progressed, it was clear that they were not. We found several factors that were common in all of these calls. 1, the returns had the direct deposit information changed from the previous year's bank account to a prepaid debit card. 2,
yeah, this is the scary situation. If it sounds to me in this case that there was some major breach of some major database, and the reasons that it would have been TurboTax or not is completely unclear. It could have been that he's going to talk about a vendor, but it's clear from other news releases that it was TurboTax, and maybe there's something about the formatting of TurboTax electronically filed returns versus other vendors that if the Utah state database was compromised, it's very important to figure, or vendors, it's very important to figure out how that happened, because that's absolutely scary. Not only is the possibility to file fraudulent returns in the future available based on just parroting back what was filed in the previous year, but additionally there's a name and social security number also that's been compromised that could be used for not only tax filings but other things.
The returns contain routing and account numbers that differ between the federal returns and the state returns. 3, most of the returns appear to have the exact 2013 return data populated in the 2014 return. The next issue we found was common was the address on the returns was the same as the address on the 2013, even when there was error in the address. And finally, since most of the filings were made through one vendor, it appeared that something in their process was compromised.
No, not necessarily. It could have been that for some reason the vendor had just uploaded a bunch of e-filed returns and another vendor didn't when the compromise took place. It could be that other vendors encrypt their e-file files and one vendor did not. Or it could have been something to do with the vendor. It's just more than that. I'm going to go to 3412, and then I'm going to go one last snippet, 4130 to 4214.
After communicating with that vendor and notifying other states of what we were finding, we talked with the Internal Revenue Service and said we think there may be a compromise of the MEF system, that's the modernized electronic filing system. The accounts in question that we were able to identify were immediately sent to the Ogden Service Center. 31 returns in that first week were confirmed suspicious. We asked them in a phone conversation to confirm on their side. We're still waiting to hear from them. Many have asked what action was undertaken by the state of Utah when it discovered this attack. In short, we hurried. We stopped all refunds until we could get our arms around it.
That's a good move.
During that first week, we found 5 different fraud schemes, 4 of which were ones we'd seen before. They were institutions, they were preparers, but one that was a new one. And the new one was someone had actual tax returns. Not just identity theft, but tax returns from the prior year. Now, as we continue to prevent the outflow of fraudulent refunds, we found great difficulty in determining the nature of the financial institution and the account information. Specifically, we found that there was no uniformity in numbering to determine traditional debit cards from traditional bank accounts. In other words, we could not tell whether we were refunding to a prepaid debit card or whether we were refunding to a legitimate bank account. There's an easy fix on this one. The easy fix is to require the financial industry to have identifier numbers in the routing number or in the account number to identify this as a prepaid debit card.
Agree with all that. Agree with all that. But since the reason why in my recommendation there I just said no direct deposits unless there's a verification of ownership of the bank account is because, who knows whether all these debit card vendors are going to end up, doing what tax collection agents want. There's no law that forces them to do that. Now, the Senate could maybe enact legislation to make that happen. But debit cards are a worldwide phenomena, and banks are all over the world, and sometimes the routing numbers just aren't going to conform to what the laws say in the United States, and those will be the ones that they'll use. So that's why I personally favor verification before direct deposits. One other nuance to go over here. When I talk about PINs, the use of a PIN allows the original scheme to stay in place. Presumably, if the taxpayer can be verified as the authentic taxpayer, then eventually the IRS will catch up with the authentic taxpayer, by the use of the PIN. There's only going to be one person that can file, and send them a notice. And 2 years down the line, they're just going to have, if they mess up on their return, they're going to have to pay anyway. And most people, when they're doing their own stuff, isn't going to just make stuff up and put it in TurboTax and upload it to get them some money. It's no person using their own identification is going to take that kind of risk. So if there is a PIN program in place, it's not so important to do the data matching, in as much that the original design of the system eventually does catch up with the taxpayer and rectify things. But still, it's not optimal. It still has room for the fraud to take place. And it can happen. Okay. And if the IRS database of PINs got compromised, well, that'd be a big waste of money and very frustrating. And the internet's going to be involved in this anyway, but you just got to hope and expect that that's not going to happen. But the real answer is between having a PIN and data matching, between the both of them, probably the integrity of the whole tax collection system will be restored. Because right now it's damaged. So am I at 3412 yet? Yeah, past that. So I'm going to go to 4130 to 4214. The last little comments I'm going to get from here.
This is not being shared in real time. The information is very, very much delayed. Sometimes we're not getting the information that we could use very timely to be able to look at the returns as they're coming. One of the things that the Senate Finance Committee may consider is the idea of moving up the filing deadline for the W-2s for employers.
And this is, again, where I disagree. It only ends up penalizing employers who may have, in the January 15th of a deadline, it's 2 weeks into the year, they got to get a W-2. There's a lot of small businesses out there. And again, it's just the policy needs to be the IRS isn't going to release a refund until there's a match of data. And that's the way it's got to be. So deadline is irrelevant under that scenario. And that's the position. And data matching is a fundamental and integral part of, not only is a refund not going to be issued if the data doesn't match, but they won't even accept the e-file. And that's a very, very fundamental part of the only viable solution there is. Otherwise, we're just going to be playing games and constantly chasing after new criminals that decide to enter this industry. Convicting one, and for every one we convict, two more come out of like rats out of the woodwork, and continue to siphon off this $5-6 billion, and that's only if they're in the United States. They won't even. We'll have nothing we can do about them if they're not.
As I think Senator Wyden indicated, we have a problem. Right now is the W-2s go out to the individuals on the 31st, but we have a big gap because the employers don't have to have them out until March 31st. So we have a 2-month gap. States are under a lot of pressure, as is the federal government, to make the refunds. This is the people's money. They've overpaid it. And yet, we can't give them the refund without knowing for certain that the right person's getting the refund.
The question is not whether it's the right person, but whether the information they should already have is verified against the assertions that are made by the taxpayer in their tax return. That's it. This whole idea of got to give the money back, to the taxpayer, even if it's 2 weeks earlier, that's just stupid. No one knows when their refund was gonna be back or not. There's no clock on it. people call all the time. They ask, when am I going to get a refund? I don't know. Probably around as long as it took last year is all I could say. It's nothing, and so, if refunds seem to take a little longer next year, well, there's... It's ridiculous. So, yeah, they feel like they want to represent, and the idea is not to hold on to taxpayer money longer than you have to. But, in this case, they're not. They're protecting the Treasury, and they're actually protecting the taxpayer by not releasing the refund until the information that is the basis for that refund, including W-2 withholding and W-2 income, is verified against the electronically filed return. So if the return is e-filed before the W-2 is released by the employer, then the return should be marked as not accepted yet, but not rejected either. And then once the W-2 is released by the employer, it's either accepted or rejected on that basis, and that's the way it should be. And it's going to take longer for people to get refunds, but, it's something that needs to be done. Otherwise, we're just sitting around and going to congressional meetings and saying a bunch of words and, acting like we're trying to act in the best interest of other people and giving squinty eyes and looking around and sending out notices to people, some of which will be incorrect, accusing people of filing false returns when they haven't. And the fundamental flaw with the whole approach is going after the criminals too late, and this idea that it's taxpayer money, we got to give it back to them immediately, even if it costs us $5 billion or bankrupts our state.
That gap is a big problem for us, and that one would help a lot. Another one is for the Senate and the House to be able to really encourage the IRS to have a more formalized sharing of information. I gave you the one example.
And sharing of information, whatever. They should have their own wage information. That's the only issue. I've already looked at that. So I'm done with this topic. I'll just label this as part 2, and hopefully this will be helpful to come up with solutions. That's the only solution that's going to work. Otherwise, we're just going to keep doing this year in, year out. And now, one last issue to talk about. It was a scary issue where this guy was saying that there were actual tax returns that people had, and they were just re-uploading them and as if they were 2014 returns with direct deposit information altered. That is scary. And if there's a PIN embedded in these files and that kind of compromise happens again, then we're back in the same boat. So there also, I think, needs to be some difference in fundamental design. Now, in computing, there is a concept known as GPG and public keys and private keys and all that. And there could be a way that a PIN can be delivered separately from the electronically filed return that is otherwise encrypted until the PIN is applied. But in this case, it should probably only be a partial PIN. The other part of the PIN being in the possession of the IRS, and the two together allows the decryption of the electronic filed returns. In the day of encryption, there's no excuse for submitting returns that are unencrypted and in plain text, as I described. But that would obviously have to take some coordination between the vendors and the IRS to come up with a system where basically eventually delivered to the IRS, who has the other half of the key. In fact, I don't think there actually has to be a separation. It could just be the electronic file with a partial key in there. It would only be openable by the IRS, who has unique keys for each person, but the two together can only open up the file. But I'm not much of a computer expert to know that what I'm describing can be done for certain, but I'm pretty sure that someone could come up with that kind of scheme, perhaps. Then it would be a much more formidable. Someone would have to crack that schema. Of course, they'd want to make the the additional keys that the IRS hold to have not be really algorithmically recreatable, and then we'll have safety. I think that's what needs to be done too. So I guess that's my last comment on all this, and I'm going to upload this.